Have a seat on your porcelain throne. It's time to talk some shit on the Powell Movement.
Welcome to the Powell Movement. I'm your host, Mike Powell, and this week has been such a fun week for me. It's been all about ski movie premieres, and holy crap, I watched 5 movies over 2 nights and I didn't get bored. With all ski movies, I expect to see jaw-dropping, mind-blowing ski footage. This has to happen, or the production company is totally blowing it. I mean, when you think of the movie structure, brands pay into the movies they sponsor, and those dollars ensure certain badass athletes get in those movies. While every once in a while, someone will sneak in without a budget because they're either that good or the production company doesn't have enough footage to make a great movie, that rarely happens anymore. And if it does, you can bet that production company is going to find paying sponsors for that athlete the next season so they can continue to film. The whole model reminds me of that 70s bumper sticker, ass, grass, or cash, nobody rides for free. And while that doesn't totally apply, the whole nobody rides for free part is true. Everything is pay to play on the highest level. And the athletes themselves, well, they are the horses. The production companies want them in their films, and if they don't produce, they're out, and it's the next man up. And no one gets paid to be in these movies. This is a paid by your sponsor's honor that is what your career is based on. It's such an interesting model. But where was I going with this? I was talking about everyone getting great footage, and that's true. The only issue is that you have to have your season planned out right. And last year, it was a tough one for snow. And if you didn't have your Tahoe trip planned right, or a lot of Alaska time, well, then you had to create something out of nothing because sponsors paid for a movie, and it's not like the production houses can take a year off. I mean, some of them are struggling right now as it is, but we don't need to talk about that. At the end of the day, it's the editing and the presentation that makes the movie. And we've all seen ski movies or segments that are set to slow, lame music, and that barely gets you fired up, even if the tricks and the airs are incredible. And then we've seen every old Seth Morrison segment that makes the audience go batshit crazy. And it's not only Seth skiing that does it, although anytime you watch that guy ski, you're going to lose your mind. But it's the music, it's the energy, it's how it's edited. It all came together around that guy. And man, I miss seeing him ski on the big screen every year. But whatever, we don't see it anymore. And while I won't see the latest Matchstick Productions movie for a few weeks, I saw TGR's Beyond the Fantasy, and it was good. It got me hyped. But I saw the Whiskey Tasting Series, which is a show for old people who want to sample whiskey and get a swag bag. And it was the perfect entertainment for that. I'm sure the real premiere at the Neptune was much rowdier. The next 4 movies I saw came from the Solomon Quality Ski Time Tour. These movies were all short movies that celebrated different aspects of skiing. The highlight for me was Camp Blank from the Blank Collective. These guys are always so creative and fun, and I'm about to get a grip of them on the podcast as that was my favorite movie of the season so far. The next one in the series that we saw was the Open movie. Think street skiing in a fun way, totally different than the old gnarly shit I used to be into with the old Step Productions crew. The crew in this movie breaks rules, has no respect for public property, and kills it and entertains all at the same time. I loved it. And then there was Drew Peterson's Feel It All. Talk about a heavy movie. Drew's story is incredible and sad all at the same time. Mental health is a hard thing to talk about at a ski movie premiere and in a ski movie when people want to be stoked. But the way that Drew hosted the event and the personality that he brings to the table in real life, and then the story that he shared on the big screen, not only brings awareness to mental health, but hopefully it'll help bring hope to people in dark places. The final film I saw was from Cody Townsend's 50 Project. It was the 50 Plus. And I'm not going to lie, I didn't stay for all of this one as I needed to get home. Sorry, Cody, but I have watched about 40 of these and I will see the 50 Plus in its entirety at some point. So that's my summary of the movie side of things from what I've seen this year, and I'll report on MSP soon. But you're not here for movies. I mean, this is a podcast and it's all about listening, not seeing. And I've got a great one for you to listen to this week. Alex Armstrong may be tiny, but she's a huge force in the ski world these days. She's a marquee athlete for TGR, and get this, she didn't start filming with a major production company until she was in her 30s. Think about that. No pro athlete starts her or his career in their 30s, but that's pretty much the case for Alex, who also goes by the nickname Army. On this one, we also get a mini view at the end with Dissent Labs' Josh Hall, and then he asks the inappropriate questions. Before we get into it, I want to ask you to do a few things for me. First, tell a friend about the show. I'm not an athlete. I'm just a dude who has the best podcast in snow because I out-research and I outwork everyone. I come up with unique questions and I produce a great show. I know, I'm totally humble about this. But since I'm not a former pro, I don't have a built-in audience. So telling a friend really helps this thing grow. So does sharing my social posts, and so does reviewing me wherever you listen, which I'll tell you how to do if you have an iPhone in the outro. Thanks for doing these things, and if you have any questions or concerns or guest suggestions, please email me at mike@thepowellmovement.com. I will get back to you. Finally, please support my sponsors by listening to their ads and buying their products. I only work with the best brands, and they are Thermic heated socks, Elan Skis, Outdoor Research, Stanley, and Best Day Brewing. Now, let's talk with Alex Armstrong. You're a hardcore horoscope person, and while I don't know much about horoscopes, does yours pretty much say that anything you drive, a truck, a sled, anything, it's gonna break and cause you heartache?
You know what is funny, Mike, is that it's eclipse season right now, and yesterday was a lunar eclipse in Libra, and I had to put my truck to rest yesterday. So, you know what? Some people say that it's not true, but it's been pretty spot on the last few weeks for me.
So you had driven down to Jackson for the big TGR premiere, and then your truck dies in Jackson. You fly home, then you fly back to fix your truck, and you do all this work. I see you on the internet, wiring your truck and doing shit that I didn't know you probably didn't even know you could do. But you're doing all this shit, and then you find out after a couple days of work that the truck's just dead.
Yeah. So essentially what happened is I drove down. It died in a parking lot. So both places that it died, it was actually perfect. And I got it a tow to one of the auto shops, and they called me last week and said, your truck's totally fixed. Come on down. And so that's what I did. I flew back, picked up my truck, and it was running fine. I sent a bunch of people some text messages saying, sorry, I won't be able to see you in Jackson because I just need to pick up my truck. And then as soon as that happened, it died on the top of Teton Pass. And fully lost power. I'm just on the side of the road. It's kind of busy. And, I feel like I was kind of prepared to lay this truck to rest. But because the mechanics were it's totally fixed, I had this little inkling of hope. So I feel like that of all things was the most devastating part, was just that I thought that it was completely fixed and it wasn't. So alas, I had it towed back to the shop. They didn't have time to fix it. So I tried to fix it myself, and I'm actually shockingly good at wiring because my cottage growing up had tons of mice in it.
Okay.
So pretty much on a 2-week basis, I had to rewire my alarm clock when I was younger. And so I took on the challenge of rewiring 30 wires to get it started. We confirmed that it was good with the multimeter, that they were all functioning. And then when I turned the truck on, a bunch of the fuses blew, one of them being the engine control module, which means something way bigger is going on with my truck. So at this point in its lifespan, it owes me nothing. And I think it's a little bit more trouble than it's worth to try and fix it at this point. So it's now a parts truck in Jackson.
All right. Well, we were going to do this interview in person. You were going to come out here for some premieres. That didn't happen, and that's okay. But another thing that I heard about you that kind of sums up exactly who you are, and I don't really know the whole tattoo, is you have a tattoo on your thigh. And what does that read, and how does that sum you up?
It says cozy or die. And so I really believe I kind of have two modes. I'm either chilling at home on the couch with my cat, in my cozy mode, I like to call it, or I'm free skiing, doing truck stuff, things of that nature, which is a bit more extreme. So I feel like I'm two people sometimes, where I'm just a bit of a chiller, but then I have this other fifth gear that I kick into where it allows me to do crazy stuff in the mountains and have the confidence to work on my truck, even though I'm probably underqualified for that.
And are you a crazy cat lady?
Yeah, big time. Big cat gal.
Okay.
I actually have another tattoo of a cat. So, yeah.
All right, fair enough. So we'll get into your ski story. It starts at Mont Ste Marie. And did your grandfather help start that place, or what's the family connection and backstory there?
Yeah, so Mont Ste Marie was started in the 60s, and my grandpa was one of the first people to build a cottage there. So once the hill was basically starting to get developed, he was one of the first people to kind of buy into it. And we were actually the 4th cottage ever built there and the first one with electricity. And yeah, it was great because basically where he decided to build was on one of the ski trails. So I had a ski in, ski out situation from the time I was born until I decided to move out west.
All right. And then you had to start dirtbagging it. But before you started dirtbagging it, ski in, ski out, which is pretty amazing. And you're born to be a skier. I mean, you have this cabin that you're going to, and you're a weekend warrior commuting from Ottawa each weekend. And it sounds like early on it was all about racing. And when did you start wearing the Lycra?
So I started skiing when I was 3 years old and then went into ski lessons as you do. And I feel like there was one day when I was 6 years old, and I totally remember this. My ski instructor at the time was like, we're doing nice, pretty turns down the hill. And I got kind of bored. So I just started straight lining and I like kind of ditched the entire lesson. and that day, my ski instructor went to my parents and was like, it's time to put her into ski racing lessons. So after that, I ended up in the ski racing program, and I did that up until I was 16.
Okay, well, you got really ahead of us, and I'm going to take it back a little bit. I mean, with ski racing, when you start out, not when you're 6, but like when you're 10, 11, 12, and things are starting to happen for you, is it one of those things where you're like, I'm going to make the World Cup and I'm going to be an Olympian? Was like that the end goal in the beginning?
Well, so I was a pretty small kid.
You're still small.
I'm still a small kid. So when I first started really being competitive about it, I wasn't even cracking the top 10 just because I was so little. And the hills at home where I'm from are really flat. So having a little bit of weight behind you really helps. So it wasn't until things got more technical when I was around 13, 14 that I started being on the podium every race. And so it was kind of a slow trajectory for me in my racing career, as it has been in my freeride career. But when I was 14, I basically got accepted onto the regional ski team, and then I was being looked at by the Quebec ski team as well. And yeah, it kind of took off from there.
Does that mean you kind of get some travel and you get to go different places with the ski team, and it seems like a little bit more than just your local hill racing?
Yeah, totally. So it's funny, Ottawa actually has the most ski racers per capita in all of Canada. And so our regional ski team is quite competitive. So I ended up on the regional ski team, and with them, I ended up going to France. I ended up going to Switzerland as well as Chile for training camps early season, whether that was in August or October, November.
Oh, that's incredible. And then it's like by the time you're 15, it looked like you were racing at the FIS level or the FIS level. What did it take to get you on that circuit?
Honestly, I was like first or third, kind of all of my career it was K2 at the time. So I guess it's like U14 or U16 now. And so that pretty much set me up for going into the FIS program pretty naturally. And the Quebec team was actually also looking at me at the time because of those results.
So you had this promising race career lined up, and then at 16, you do the whole summer ski trip thing to Chile, and that's a life changer. What was so special about that trip?
Well, so as you can imagine, I was pretty dedicated to ski racing at the time, and we flew down and immediately were hit with a big snowstorm, which cancels our training. And I honestly was super bummed that it canceled my training because I was just like so hardcore dedicated to it. And I was like, what is this powder stuff? I'd never seen powder before because I'm from the East Coast of
so it's
Canada.
Hard and fast, right?
Yeah. And so we get back to training, and then the second storm hits, and our coaches like kind of encourage us, like, go ski powder. This is like what people live for. Like, we won't be able to set up gates, but you should try it out. And I was like, what is this? Kind of like the second time. And then there was a third storm while we were there. And by the third storm, I was like, powder skiing is it. I was like kind of like totally sold on powder skiing. And I was kind of like, maybe I just like skiing and not ski racing. The other like kind of sidebar was there's 2 ski bums who were staying at the hostel that we were out washing dishes for their stay. And they were literally just traveling around skiing. And that kind of also sparked something in me that I was like, whoa, you can just ski without ski racing?
So that's pretty cool. And then, in the grand scheme of things, while you're a ski racer, were you into the culture at all? I mean, because the whole new school movement had happened, the big mountain stuff is happening, and you're kind of, in your little bubble of race, but are you aware of all the other parts of skiing, or does that happen when you get to Chile?
That kind of happens more when I get to Chile, honestly. Like, when you're a ski racer on the East Coast of Canada, that's pretty much it. Like, you do see like the park kids and everything, but they have a totally different culture. So it's quite segregated, to be honest. And yeah, I think the only thing that I'd seen up to that point about like freeride was one of my coaches had a yearbook DVD and we watched that on one of our ski trips. And I was actually so blown away by Ingrid and Sarah in that film. But I never really like delved deeper because I was so at that point committed to ski racing.
And so you get home from Chile, and do you tell your parents and coaches like, hey, I'm done with racing?
No, I actually completed that year. Like, I still raced that entire year and went to nationals and did the whole thing. And at that point, the Quebec development team was seriously looking at me as like a potential athlete for them. And I think my entire family was pretty devastated that summer when I broke the news that I just wanted to ski for fun and not continue with ski racing at that point. I mean, as anyone knows who's been in ski racing, it's super expensive and it's such a huge time commitment that I didn't feel like drawing those like resources from my family was super fair if my heart wasn't totally in it. So I think it was like sadder for them than it was for me quitting ski racing at that point.
And are your coaches kind of pissed? Like, hey, this is a girl that we've brought up to be awesome and she is awesome and now she's just quitting?
Yeah, I had like a lot of like messages from various ski coaches that I had had through my life that were like, we really just want you to come out to the tryouts, maybe doing something less competitive with like reinvigorate your passion for ski racing. But I went to the tryouts for my regional team again, and then I just kind of said, I think I'm good.
So your skiing turns into coaching. But outside of skiing, like, who were you? What kind of shit did you do in high school when it wasn't ski season?
Dude, it was so weird. I feel like I went through like a midlife crisis when I was 16 years old because basically up until that point, my whole identity was wrapped up in ski racing. So I kind of had to like rediscover who I was as a person at a very young age. So I didn't really have much of an identity out of skiing. I ended up ski coaching, which was kind of just like a fallback because like that was who my community was. And then I ended up actually partying quite a bit and kind of barely graduated high school because I kind of always knew that I just wanted to move out west and become a ski bum.
So there's no thought of college or anything when you're in high school?
You know, I kind of toyed with the idea because there's a lot of pressure from my parents for that to happen. But in my heart of hearts, I knew that wasn't really for me. So it was hard for me to like really like dedicate myself to school because it was just something that I wasn't interested in. Regardless of how I felt about ski racing, I was like fully committed to skiing, and like skiing like totally lit me up. So I was like, I know I'm moving out west.
And even before you moved out west, were you at home when you first hurt your knee? Because I think you were like 19 when you first did something to it.
Yeah, I was actually ski coaching. When I was 18, I was ski coaching, and I felt like we kind of had like a pretty mellow session that day, like where we were, you know, as ski coaches, oftentimes you end up standing beside the ski course and just watching people go through it and not really skiing yourself. So I was like, I'm going to go for a free run at the end of the day. And I don't think I was training as much as I was previously. So I wasn't as strong. And I was like, had my race dins like set to like where I was at when I was 16 kind of deal. And I just like hit a bump and totally blew my knee apart, which was pretty sad because then I was totally kind of disconnected from the ski racing community at that point.
You're stuck working at a ski shop, but then the next major proud parent moment that you have is your next big job. You go tree planting in the summer, and I'm sure that's what every parent wants their kid to go do is do back-breaking work. Is that what that was? Being that you're like 5'1", it's got to be like the hardest job ever.
You know what? It's actually funny. Being 5'1", you're actually closer to the ground, so bending over is slightly easier for the shorter people. So I feel like I almost had an advantage being a little bit shorter. The only thing with tree planting is like you kind of have to be very strategic if you're shorter because you can't walk over things as much. But my parents, I don't know what they thought about the tree planting thing. I think they were just kind of stoked that I was like doing something else other than hanging around Ottawa, working at a ski shop, ski coaching. I think they were actually kind of stoked that I went tree planting. And it was actually the first time I had ever set up a tent by myself or gone camping.
Okay.
So It was like, I'm going tree planting. I went to MEC, which is basically the Canadian version of REI, bought a tent and like had to learn all of those skills as well as learn how to tree plant, which is pretty backbreaking work because you get paid per tree.
How much money can you make in a summer tree planting?
You can make tons of money. I think my best year ever, because I did it for 8 years in the end, I made close to 60 grand.
Whoa, that's incredible.
Yeah. If you're solid and you're efficient and you're willing to do a summer and fall season, you're making anywhere from 400 to like $1,000 a day, depending on how hard you're willing to work.
That's incredible. So that sounds like a very lucrative job. So while it is backbreaking, the great thing about it is that there's a lot of money. What's the worst thing about tree planting?
I think the worst thing about tree planting on a day-to-day basis, it's the fact that you have to plant in any condition. I just remember one day I was working out of Port Alberni, which is on Vancouver Island, and that's where you go to do fall planting. And our block was just under 1,000-meter elevation, and at the top of like the cut block, you could see the snow line, and when it snows, the day is canceled, but you could see it there, and it never came into the block. And so it was actually the coldest day of planting I've ever had in my life. I ended up burning a bunch of tree boxes to keep myself warm. I ended up like walking up the hill to like find a truck because I was like getting hypothermic. It was like kind of a bit of an emergency day for me, to be honest. So that was probably my worst day tree planting on a day-to-day basis. But I think the biggest thing is that you just end up putting your life on hold for a whole summer. Like, if you think about it, all your friends are doing jobs where they can like work 9 to 5 or they work in a city and they can like see each other. And the big thing is like you're stuck with the same 60 people for like 6 months essentially, which isn't a bad thing, but it's a hard launch back into society after that for sure.
And it sounds like one of the great things that came out of it was you get the idea to move out west from there, given you thought about it when you were a kid. But were there people there that were like, hey, you need to go here, and that's how you end up in Lake Louise?
Yeah, my first season out west, I actually went tree planting first, and there was a bunch of ski bums doing that, obviously, because basically they work during the summer, they have this like big nest egg, and then they go on EI, or some people call it Trudeau's ski team, for the winter.
That's just like Canada's kind of welfare system for people?
Yeah, exactly. So I actually ended up at Big White for a season because of those people, and then Lake Louise pretty quickly after that.
You move out, and what does that look like? I mean, I don't think you have a truck or a camper or anything like that yet. Are you living out of your car? Do you have roommates? What does that look like your first season in Lake Louise or in Big White, whatever?
Well, Big White, I was there, and it was a 2-bedroom with myself and 5 other guys.
Okay.
So we had 2 guys who were sharing the king bed in their room, and then there was like my room, which was like 2 different sets of bunk beds. So we were pretty chock-a-block in there. And then when I moved to Lake Louise, I was like, I don't want to do that again. So I ended up paying a little bit more, but I had my own room in the house, which was pretty sweet. And the bus system, because I was living in Banff and working in Lake Louise, the bus system there is really sweet. So I actually didn't even need a car for either of the first 2 seasons that I was out west.
Now it's time for my first sponsor break. And when the temperature goes nuclear cold, I don't hit the mountain without my Thermic heated socks. They are the original heated sock and still the industry leader after 20 years. It's a total game changer. Trust me, if your feet aren't working properly because they're frozen, you're not skiing or snowboarding at your best. And I make sure that doesn't happen by always wearing my Thermic socks. And this year, they're better than ever. Thermic's new Smart Elastic Technology heated socks are a world's first for heated socks. These set socks are a high-performance fitting, thin ski sock where the patented heat components have stretch rather than a big, cumbersome heat band and element. So they literally feel like you're wearing your normal favorite pair of performance socks. But if heat isn't for you, don't worry. Thermic has you covered with socks for winter with their athlete-tested and proven Dissent line of socks. Some of you might be blessed with feet that never give you issues, but most of us aren't, and that's where Dissent Labs comes in. They've engineered performance socks with the help of an elite athlete team to eliminate things like chafing and heel blisters in your boots when you're touring or splitboarding. For over a decade, the people at Dissent have been making socks that are consistently the best thing you can put on your feet before you get out there. They have a distinctive locked-on fit that never seems to change. At the end of the day, Thermic and Dissent socks are the go-to socks for people that know. Drop into your local boot fitter and retailer and you'll see what I mean. Next up, it's Elan Skis. And while I've been talking about Elan all summer, I've been keeping some information from you that I'll share today. The award-winning ski that started Elan's cult following here in the US, the Ripstick, is brand new for 24-25. Think all new molds, all new sizes, new widths, and new tech. I got to ski these skis last season, and I'll say, the new models are still lightweight, they still have a ton of pop, and they'll still make you a better skier. But these new skis are even more stable at speed, which will allow them to handle burlier terrain than ever before. While you get more out of the Ripstick collection, Elan was able to build them without making them more demanding. So Ripstick fits even more skiers than before. While I loved my original Ripstick, what I skied last year was noticeably more fun, and I know the cult of Elan is going to grow even more with this new collection. If you're a person that demos skis and you haven't tried an Elan yet, make sure you try one this year and you'll feel how fun these skis are. To find out more about all things Elan, head on over to elanskis.com. My final sponsor this round is Stanley, and if you haven't been hearing a lot about Stanley lately, you must be living under a rock. Sure, you used to know them for keeping your grandpa's coffee hot in that signature green bottle, and they still make that, but Stanley absolutely blew up in 2023, and everybody is still talking about them. I've been telling you about how incredible their products are at keeping your drinks hotter and colder than anyone else for 7 years now. I mean, they invented the category in 1913, and while they've always done well, the world now knows that if you don't have a Stanley, you don't have the best, and I love having the best. I personally use Stanley pint glasses every single day, and I swear by them. And my wife and so many others out there can't live without their Stanley quenchers. Recently, I've integrated Stanley food storage devices into my ski routine. Instead of buying $20 burgers at the mountain, I buy food and it stays piping hot in our Stanleys, and I end up saving at least $70 a week by not buying food. While that's cool, Stanley really has something for everyone, and you can check out all their amazing products over at stanley1913.com. Those are my sponsors. Now, let's jump back into the podcast. And it sounds like you did a bunch of odd jobs, but eventually you get your job as a patroller. And you're a great skier technically, but did you know anything about being a ski patroller, or do you just kind of apply and go through the training?
Dude, I didn't even apply. The ski patrol director at the time, Kat Beats, who's actually one of my very long-term friends, I went to the red and white party the year before, and I guess I made an impression on her because I was really fun and hanging out with everyone, and I fit in seamlessly with her crew. She actually approached me in August and was like, hey, you're a great skier. We'd love to have you come on board with ski patrolling. And at that point, I had actually been ski coaching for 8 years, and I was pretty burnt out on that.
Yep.
So I was like, hell yeah, I'd love to. Just so you know, I have no first aid training and no avalanche training at that point. I had been in the backcountry one time with a friend who was quite knowledgeable and on ski patrol at Lake Louise. So she was like, oh, that's no worries. We'll get you trained up. And I was like, okay, perfect. I'm on board. And then after I signed the contract, she was like, oh yeah, by the way, it only pays $7.50 an hour. I was like, oh shit, but whatever. I was like, I'm excited for a new kind of career path, I guess.
Well, before we talk about the things that you do as a ski patroller, you're making $7.50 an hour. That's not a livable wage, I would think, in one of those mountain towns, is it?
No, not really. But the nice thing for me was I had tree planting to fall back on. You're making a pretty good chunk of change. And the other thing is, I don't judge anyone for going on EI, but I never felt like I needed to go on EI because I had skills and I was happy to maybe dwindle down my nest egg a little bit to supplement that. So I felt like ski patrolling was a really cool thing that I could do. And even though I was not going to be making enough money to support myself, I had this tree planting nest egg to fall back on.
With the whole ski patrolling gig, we're going to talk about a bunch of things that you did. Do you get early ups and sick runs every POW day?
You could if you wanted to. Basically how it works with ski patrol is you do get early ups on POW days. There's avalanche control that has to go and control the mountain, but there's also just general ski patrol work that requires you to do run checks. So you go down and you lift fence lines up, you make sure all hydrants and anything that's metal on the ski hill is marked properly. So, you could maybe take a run before you do that if you wanted. With
the avalanche control, were you part of that? Were you throwing explosives?
Yeah, so one thing that kind of set me apart from the rest of the ski patrol was my ski ability. So even though I didn't have the best knowledge of avalanche control and first aid when I first started out, I was a very strong skier. So they actually wanted me on avalanche control because I was really good at ski cutting in sketchy places.
Okay.
And so they were like more than willing to have me up there because they totally trusted me and my ski ability in these like rocky kind of sketchy zones. And so I actually ended up on avalanche control more often than not because of that.
Were there any close calls with dynamite, or does that all go as planned?
I mean, for myself personally, it all went as planned. There was one time that there was a shot that didn't go off. And what happens is you have to babysit that shot for a couple hours. So typically what happens when you light a shot of dynamite is you have 2 to 2.5 minutes until it goes off. So it gives you a little bit of leeway if you misfire, especially if the dynamite stick is on a string or a rope, you can send it off again. But the really complicated thing is if it doesn't fire, like if you pull the trigger and after 3 minutes it doesn't go off, it's considered a dud. And then there's protocols around how you handle that. And yeah, you basically have to babysit it. I forget what the hour amount is, but I believe it's 3 hours.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then did you have to pull passes, and what were those interactions like?
Dude, honestly, I was very chill about pulling passes. I only pulled one pass ever.
Oh.
Most of the time, I had a conversation with people because half the time it's people who maybe don't know the rules. Especially in Lake Louise, you have lots of people from Europe. So basically in Europe, rope lines mean you're accepting your own risk when you go under a rope line there. So a lot of the time, people just don't know that they're doing something bad. The other half of the time, it's like people who just wanted to powder hound a little bit. And I normally would just have a conversation with them, or like what we would do is we would bring them to a patrol shack, and then we would have a thing where we would be like, this is the reason why you can't do that. You're on top of an open run. So it was more of an educational moment.
You weren't the asshole cop?
No, dude, for sure. I totally understood why people were ducking ropes, but I feel like education over alienation was much more effective.
For sure. And then how many times do you called for an injury each week? Like, I mean, are you handling like 10 different people down a week?
Lake Louise is actually quite busy for injuries. Most of the time, they're fairly benign. I mean, not for the person, but it's like usually a knee or a shoulder or something like that. But my second year patrolling, I actually had this thing, we called it the black cloud, where you end up on these really gnarly calls. And yeah, so I had the black cloud for the better half of my second year patrolling. So I ended up on a lot of medical calls that year.
What was the worst that you experienced?
I mean, death.
Yeah, I mean, that's terrible.
Yeah, I mean, multiple times you have these things called code blacks, but I do have one positive one where I had this guy, I could actually hear his breathing over the radio because a lifty called it in, and he had punctured both of his lungs and he was bleeding and punctured both of his lungs. It's called a bilateral pneumohemothorax, and he also had broken so many ribs that he had flail chest and it was just a pile of mush basically. And we ended up saving his life because I could hear his breathing over top of the radio. I called up to Paradise Hut, which is our highest hut, and asked them who their fastest skier was and got them down to it as fast as possible. And we ended up doing a blood transfusion with the ambulance in like the patrol shack. And this guy survived. So like, that's like one of those things that you kind of hang on to as a ski patrol, where it's like, this guy was having a life-threatening moment, and without your expertise and your quick acting action, that guy would have like passed away for sure.
And you make $7.50 an hour, which is crazy.
And you make $7.50 an hour.
Did that guy at least get you a gift card or some flowers?
No, he didn't. But I checked his ID and his name was Alex and he was from Ottawa. And I was like, this is creepy.
That is pretty creepy.
Yeah.
Wow, that's so crazy. Then when you think about you as a pro skier, which is way fast forward, but I'm just going to talk about that now. What was the worst thing that's happened to you or others in the mountains that you've been like right first responder on, or to yourself?
I mean, I've had a lot of injuries. I've had 5 knee injuries of varying degrees since I became a pro skier. And luckily, I've been able to ski out of all of them. I have been present for another death in the mountains. But other than that, I've honestly been very lucky in terms of the amount of times that I go out into the mountains and like ratio to injury.
And thinking about your proness or pros in general, most pros don't have that patroller sense of what could go wrong in the mountains. But since you do, does that make you almost more cautious in the mountains because you've seen so much?
Yeah, 100%. I feel like having that experience, I feel like it puts me in kind of like a protective mode rather than like a go get 'em mode. One thing one of my mentors, Dave Petch from Lake Louise, always told me is like, it's a process of elimination. If you can't find a reason not to ski it, then you should probably ski it.
Okay.
And I've definitely kept that pretty close to my heart. And there's a lot of days that I kick myself when I'm out there where I'm like, oh, I'm being too cautious because I see people skiing things that I thought about and they're skiing them, but I'm like not willing to put myself in that situation. And I think to myself and I get into the spiral loop of like, wow, you're too cautious. You're keeping it too mellow. Like you should be whatever, you know,
Yeah.
that should word that puts you into like this weird kind of mindset. But at the end of the day, and as I get older, I definitely get less and less of that, I guess, FOMO mentality. And I just totally believe that there's a day where you're going to be in the right place at the right time on the right line, and it's all going to line up for you. And I kind of have gotten really good at blocking out other people's influence because of that. And I feel like I have gained a lot of self-trust because of the ski patrolling background, I guess.
Okay. And when we think about you starting to kind of move forward in your career, it sounds like the first big break that you have comes at 26 years old, which is crazy. There's some people that are 26 where their careers are ending, especially like a lot of the park guys. But this is when everything starts for you. You're in a big mountain contest at Lake Louise, and you don't get noticed for the win. It's like you get noticed for crashing, it sounds like. What's the story behind that?
I mean, I think the first thing everyone should know is like I'm a skier at heart, and regardless of pro skiing, like that's like my number one priority. It just kind of happened that day that I was ski patrolling, and my ski patrol director at the time said, hey, if you want to enter the ski comp, like feel free to do it, but make sure you're back in uniform right after kind of deal. And because I don't have any like thing riding on my like comp career, I kind of just went for it and I hit this big double, but the venue had been open from halfway down. And so I hit this big double and I come out of it cooking and I hit this cat track. And you know, when you're in recovery mode and you're like just trying to be as cat-like and as strong as you can and hang on to it, that was like what I was doing. And I just remember in my head this moment of letting go. I was like, I don't care anymore. And I just ate shit spectacularly, like tomahawk, lost skis. And as I'm tomahawking, I'm like, oh, I got to run up there and grab my ski. And I guess between the line and my quick to act run up and grab my ski and like still make it down, there was a K2 rep in the Rockies area, saw that, and he was very impressed by it.
Who was the K2 rep?
It was Sam Tufts. Do you know Sam Tufts?
I don't.
Okay, it was her dad. She's like a pro snowboarder filmer out of Whistler.
Okay.
Anyways, it was her dad, and he like came up to me and was like, yo, do you want a pair of skis? Let's chat later. And I was like, oh my God, okay. I'm like mildly concussed and I've got to get back into my ski patrol uniform and going back to work, I guess.
You go back to work, but eventually you end up rocking K2 everything. You're head to toe. You're even wearing the goggles that didn't last that long, but you're all in on K2. And when you have a little support like that, even though it's not money or anything, it's a lot of product. But does that help build your confidence and almost show you that you haven't been wasting your time planting trees and then working your ass off in the summer and then skiing your ass off in the winter? Like there's an actual end game to all of this?
Yeah, totally. I mean, at that time, I was fully on track to become a paramedic and I was like kind of going that direction. And as soon as that happened, I was like, whoa, maybe I could be a pro skier. And that was like a weird seed to be planted at 26. But at the same time, it felt like there was a lot of urgency because you're 26. Like you've got to do it now or never. And so I totally threw myself at that. And I think everyone who's a pro or a semi-pro knows that you don't get into that position by accident. So basically, as soon as I got that free pair of skis, I just threw myself at it. I started trying to grow my Instagram. I actually didn't have Instagram before then or a reliable cell phone, and got that all geared up, and then started cold calling different companies, or cold emailing, I guess is a more appropriate term for it. Yeah.
Well, the next big thing I feel like is Lindsey Dyer comes to Lake Louise. How do you end up getting hooked up with her? And were you almost starstruck when you're skiing with her, or did that not even enter your head?
I was so nervous. So Ski Big 3 is kind of like the tourism board that works with Lake Louise, Norquay, and Sunshine. And Lindsey Dyer's coming to town, so they've got to get a shoot together. And I think that they actually had the shoot filled and then someone dropped out. And so they needed a last minute replacement. And so they called Lake Louise and was like, who's your best skier on staff? And they said me. And I was like, one, honored. And second, like, this is very daunting. I'm going to have to meet Lindsey Dyer. And I was so nervous. And she was actually the most lovely human being ever. And she taught me so much in that week. And it was really cool. I got to work with this company called Topo Films, and they're out of Squamish. And I work with them all the time now.
Oh, that's cool. So you make that connection there. And then you have that edit that comes out with Lindsey. And I'm sure that kind of inspires you to push it further. This is right around when you make your self-titled short film, Army, because that's what people call you. And was that an idea that you came up with on your own, or you made happen, or how did that one come to be?
That was actually Dan Thompson. He's a Banff local. He does a ton of film and video for Ski Big 3, and he actually came up with the idea because he was kind of getting force-fed all these ski instructors in terms of talent, and he was like, no way, like the ski patrollers are way sicker. So he ended up filming me for a bunch of different things for Ski Big 3, and we just connected, and he brought that to life and really wanted to tell that story, and I was so stoked. And that really launched things and showed people that you could get a project off the ground and you could start marketing yourself in some way.
That whole thing is all about passion. It kind of shows you as this dirtbag ski bum living in your truck. And we haven't really talked about that, but you lived in like a Chevy Cavalier at one point doing stuff. You lived in your truck, and you are that dirtbag ski bum. That was you with some jobs and able to make ends meet. But that whole thing was all passion-based, and then it enters into film festival circuit, and that won awards and stuff. Like, it got people to notice, like 6.5 minutes got people to notice who you were.
It was a pretty wild ride. I was full ski bum. I was never really on this pro skier trajectory, and I feel like until K2 and that short film really came out.
You pretty much have a video resume from that, and it sounds like you're a go-getter. You're cold calling brands, and you're getting your name out there, and North Face bites on that. And do you pretty much make that North Face sponsorship happen on your own? Like, they weren't coming to you being like, oh, we saw your film. You were like force-fed it to them, and they're like, holy shit, we have to work with this girl.
Yeah, essentially I made a ski resume. It was like a one-page Canva kind of sort of situation, and I sent it to the North Face Canada rep, which I got like an email off someone, I forget who, and I was so shocked when I got an email response back, and then I had a phone call with them, and they were like, yeah, let's send you some gear. I was like, whoa, this is happening. That was like, I'm 27 at the time, like that's all happened within a year. And it was crazy. They sent me a bunch of gear. And then the next thing you know, unfortunately for them, but I believe Angel, Hadley, and Tatum were all out with a knee injury at the time. And those were like the three main ski girls. I ended up getting invited to Island Lake Lodge with the North Face crew that December. And I had only been getting like flow at that time since October. And they saw me ski and they saw my attitude and they ended up signing me.
It's time for my second round of sponsors, and I'm starting this out with outdoor research. First and foremost, when I signed on with OR, I knew there wasn't an outerwear brand on the market that performs as well as what OR has been putting out in the marketplace for over 40 years. That's what happens when you test your gear in the absolutely terrible, soggy conditions that we can get here in the Pacific Northwest. As we all know, days in the mountains are always more fun when you're warm and dry, and that's what people trust OR to deliver time after time. I'll tell you, on cold days, I live in my men's Snow Crew down jacket. This is hands down the warmest jacket I've ever owned. And for those standard Northwest days, I rock the Snow Crew jacket and pant, which keeps me comfortable. And it's one of those fits where if you don't see me ski, I look like a pro. Really, what's rad about OR is the style that they've been bringing to the table lately. While mountaineers have always sworn by OR's quality and performance, now athletes like legend Mark Abma, world champion Troy Podmilsack, and X Games gold medalist Zoe Atkin are making OR gear look cooler than ever. I've been loving OR products since I first bought my Outdoor Research rain jacket when I moved to Seattle in 2000. And I know you will too. If you want to be warm and dry and look cool this season, head on over to OutdoorResearch.com and see what I'm talking about. My final sponsor is Best Day Brewing. And with snow season right around the corner, skiers, snowboarders, weekend warriors, tubers, sledders, snowbikers, snowmobilers, you get it. The doers of winter are starting to get ready to shred. And post-shred, it's all about après. And this year, do après right. Forget about the calories, forget about the alcohol, and forget about getting in trouble on the way home. Because with a beer from Best Day Brewing, you know you'll get all the flavor of your favorite beer without the alcohol. Whether it be the West Coast IPA, a hazy IPA, a Kolsch, the Electro Lime, or my new favorite flavor, the Natural Pills, you won't have to worry about anything but having your best day ever when you have a best day. Blind taste tests prove that you won't be able to taste the difference between your favorite beer and a best day. I mean, the only difference you'll notice is how good you feel in the morning, and you're going to remember what you did last night, which is almost as refreshing as a best day. So next time you're at the store, pick up a 6-pack of Best Day, or you can always buy some on Amazon or at bestdaybrewing.com, and you can thank me later. Those are my sponsors. Now let's jump back into the podcast. When that edit came out, you dropped a huge cliff to flat. And what's the thought process? Kind of like the conditions are right and I need to prove myself and here's my chance. I better just hold it together.
That's exactly it. You nailed it. It was kind of this really flat, weird cliff. And Austin Smith, Johnny Collinson, and Rob Hewley were all on that trip. And they were like not down with this cliff. And I was like, all right, I'm down with this cliff. Or I guess I got to be down with this cliff. So I get to the top. Our guide points me into the direction of like where the takeoff is. And he's like, that's the takeoff. Because at that time, I had never done visual inspection. So I like had no idea how to like tell what something was from the top. So this guide points me in and I'm like at the top. And I feel like this is like the biggest moment of my life. I'm like, you got to do it. And I just go into it full pin and I try to like tuck and then kind of open up and do a little roll down the windows. But there is like 70 centimeters of snow. And so I ended up sticking it. And I think Max and Carl, who are both at the North Face and ended up signing me, they were at the bottom and they were so hyped. They were so fired up. And so was I. And it was just like, as soon as that happened, I feel like they were like, she's got it.
And you can hear the hoots and hollers when you land in the edit. It's just like people are so stoked that you hit it and you're able to ski away from it, which is awesome. Then you get that contract, which is incredible. I ask about money all the time. When you get a first contract with North Face, I mean, is it something significant? I mean, it's probably better than your 750 an hour patroller job. But I mean, are you getting like 20 grand and then product and stuff like that?
No, very much less than that.
Okay.
Especially because it was like the North Face Canada that signed me.
Okay. Yeah, it's loonies and toonies up there.
Oh, yeah. It's a bit Canadian peso-ish.
Yeah. But North Face does so many cool things. So while it might not be a ton of money, it is some money. And like when you think about it, like you get to go to the athlete summit with the North Face and they bring in so many different types of athletes. You're like a first year pro athlete pretty much at 27, 28 years old. Does it feel like you almost have imposter syndrome when you go to something like that?
Oh, dude, I didn't even have a goggle sponsor. No one else was paying me other than the North Face at that point. And I literally stopped tree planting 4 days before my first athlete summit.
Whoa.
Yeah, so it's like I was still doing everything the same other than I now have this North Face contract and I knew I wasn't going into the season to ski patrol that year. It was fully like I showed up and I was like, oh my God, I am very overwhelmed.
And then here's where my timeline kind of gets messed up because you've had so many knee injuries. Did you hurt your knee after the athlete summit, like in the beginning of the season, or when's the next knee injury happen? Because it seems like your career is starting to really pick up and then you blow a knee.
Yeah, I had a lot of momentum at that point, and I felt like I was like really kind of on this precipice of quote unquote making it. And then I'm in Revelstoke. I've got this little bop lined up, and my friend Kate Target has like gone and done a 3 off it, and I was like, I'll try a 3. And I line up the trajectory and everything, and I'm ready to go. And on the takeoff, I just get bucked and I land full 180 and I tore my knee apart, like ACL, MCL, meniscus. And my knee was actually so unstable that they ended up repositioning my IT band.
But you say you earlier you said you were able to ski away from all your knee injuries. That sounds like such a horrific one. Were you able to actually ski out of that?
Yeah, I still skied out of that one.
You must have a high threshold for pain.
I guess so. I think also ski racing taught me how to ski on one ski pretty well too. But it got pretty swollen pretty quick. And honestly, I find when things get swollen pretty quick, it kind of almost casts it a little bit.
Like stabilizes it so it can't move
around. Yeah, it kind of stabilizes it. Yeah. So I skied out of that one, ended up at the hospital there, and then it was really cool. I had actually met Tatum Minode at the Athlete Summit that year, and we connected pretty well, and she's just such a sweetheart. She was actually probably one of my first calls, and I was like, yo, Tatum, I blew my knee apart, and she's like, I got you. She sent an email to Dr. Hurd, who's the surgeon in Banff, who's like one of the best, and I got in the next day.
Oh, nice. So you were able to get that fixed quickly because that's tough to do sometimes in Canada, and you get yourself back together. But we were talking about sponsors a little bit earlier. I might as well talk about the rest of them now, and then we'll get into Whistler and stuff like that. Do you make Smith happen, and do you make Blizzard and Technica happen? Is it like you just sending the resume out, or does it get to the point where people actually want you?
So Smith and Blizzard and Technica kind of happened through a shop in Banff, which is no longer, but it was Banff Soul run by Andrew Maturgio, and he was a pretty big supporter of me. So he ended up making those connections, but those were very much on like the regional Canadian levels. So those weren't really paying the bills by any means.
Okay. And then eventually you go from Blizzard to RMU, a much smaller boutique brand. What's the reasoning behind that? It's just like you're on a Canadian program and you're kind of getting lost in the shuffle because all the Americans are getting the attention, and RMU, they're going to focus on you and ABMA and like a couple others?
Yeah, that's pretty much exactly it. They made me an offer I couldn't refuse, RMU, which was really cool. Like, I actually was ski touring with Mark Warner, who runs another ski podcast.
Yeah, I know Mark.
Yeah, and we ran into the owner of it, Mike Weishi, and we have this time in the season where Whistler Peak Chair is not open, and we call it peak training season. And so you ski tour up the backside of Whistler Peak, and there's a bunch of people up there, and Mike Weishi is one of them, and I was like just cruising down, and he thought I was sick. And then the next fall, he ended up offering me this crazy contract for me, which was like a lot more money, the opportunity to film with a big ski production company like a TGR or MSP and build my own ski. And I respectfully brought that to Blizzard, and they told me they couldn't match it.
Yeah, you got to move on. It's what's best for you. I mean, they're just giving you free product and hoping for a ton of exposure. And if they're not going to invest in you, you've got to go with someone that is. And when you want to invest in your future, while being at Lake Louise is great and you have a lot of support there and a lot of things have happened there, when people want to make their careers bigger in Canada, it seems like they go to Whistler. And you, I think you buy a sled and you buy a truck and you head out to Whistler to make your career bigger in skiing. But when you get there, it also sounds like you have an all-time housemate. How'd you end up living with like a legend like Kai Peterson?
Again, Tatum Minode, my sweet angel baby. I called her and I was like, hey, I'm moving to the Sea to Sky. And she's like, I've got a spot for you. So I ended up living in the basement suite of Kai Peterson, who she's quite tight with. So that was really cool for her to set that up. And I had been living in my camper the season before and towing my sled behind it, trying to figure out where I wanted to live. And I think one thing that really sat with me is when I was leaving Whistler in the Pemberton area, I felt sad.
Okay.
So that's kind of how I made my decision, was to go back because I didn't want to leave it in the first place.
And when you're living at Kai Peterson's, if you want to, you can spy on Mark Abma because he is right next to him, I think. And you become good friends with both Mark and Kai, and you get to go ski with those dudes a lot, and they show you around the different backcountry zones and teach you how to use your sled a little bit, just because I'm guessing you're new to it.
Honestly, I didn't ski with them that much, but what was really cool is Mark Abma also has a basement suite, and across the way, one of my best friends, Emily Childs, moved into his basement suite. So I could literally, from my kitchen window, look into that basement suite and see Emily. And I feel like they were like, who are these kooky chicks from the interior with like these like suspect cars and sledding, can't even start their own sled kind of situations. So we didn't actually end up going out with Mark or Kai that much, but it was really cool that they like housed me and Emily and we were backyard neighbors.
Did you at least get to use like all his little pools and hot tubs and stuff?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, that was more than on the table. Between Kai, Abma, and then across the street from them is Daryl Treadway. There is 3 saunas, and one of them was going at any point in time, and there was a river running through all of our backyards. So it was pretty idyllic, honestly.
Yeah, it is such a special place. I went to Kai's house and interviewed him in that basement suite at one point. So I know exactly where you were, and I know where Abma's was from there, and all those little pools, which is really, really cool. But that first season in Whistler, I think that's when you shoot for Skier Rich, and that's you and Whistler heading out in the backcountry for the first time with your sled. And that project, it did really well. Like, you get nominated for IF3 Performance of the Year. How huge was that for you?
That was actually insane. But to kind of like smooth out the timeline, I ended up being at Kai's for the 2020 year when it was like COVID. And then the next year I filmed Skier Rich. So that's like the only thing that was like a little bit different. But yeah, it was insane. And I had such an amazing group around me to make that happen, including my partner, Max. He had never filmed before and he totally picked up the camera and the drone and figured that out and filmed me for the whole season because I was looking for a filmer at the beginning of the season. I was like, oh, this is going to be expensive. And he was like, well, I like to do it because I've never done that before. And he's very mechanically inclined. Yeah, so we made Skier Rich together and I ended up getting a female performance nomination.
You say hiring a filmer is really expensive, and it's really nice to have a built-in filmer with your boyfriend. But what would it have cost if you were to hire a filmer for that? I mean, would that have been like a 10 grand kind of thing out of your pocket? Because someone who's a professional filmer is definitely going to want a little bit of money for their time.
Dude, it would have been 20 or 30 grand.
Holy shit.
Like for the amount of days that he filmed, plus expenses, paying for gas for his sled, gas for his truck, because filmers typically build that into their rate or ask for it on top of that.
For sure.
Like it would have been astronomical. It would have been something that I would not have been able to afford, or like maybe not be able to convince my sponsors after a knee injury and like a very limited library of ski films before that.
And I feel like the Skier Rich series kind of helps you get to the next level of ski films, because the next big thing that you film for is Blank. How do you end up hooking up with the Blank Collective crew? Is that through sponsors? Is that through them seeing all your parts and stuff that you've put out and being like, hey, we've got to film with her? How did that work out?
I mean, whenever you're filming with a production company, your sponsors do have to pony up a little bit of cash. But really how it all started was I was buddies with Alexi Godbout at that point and Jeff Thomas, who was the main filmer.
Jeff doesn't get enough credit. I just watched his Head movie. I don't know if you've seen it because it hasn't come out yet, but it is fantastic. He's so good.
Yeah, I'm actually judging IF3 this year, so I've seen a lot of movies, including that one. And dude, he did a great job. He did a great job, as per usual.
Yep.
But yeah, so I knew those guys, and I was like, how do I get involved? And they were like, this is what the buy-in is. And as soon as I got a sponsor on board, we hit the ground running, and I got to film with my first production company ever, which was very cool for me.
And what's the difference like that for you? Because everything else you've done, you've kind of directed yourself, except for like the Lindsey project and Army was kind of directed by other people. But what's different when you are just the skier and you show up and just have to ski? Is that kind of refreshing?
Oh man, it was such a weight off my shoulders in so many ways. Like someone would just text me and tell me where I was supposed to be, and I would show up and I would do the thing. And it's just like so much less mental energy than I was using before, which I felt like kept me a little bit fresher. But there's also learning curves to working with production companies. Like you're not the only athlete anymore. So you have to learn how to like share lines and navigate that. And I'm definitely a bit more like of a B type personality. So a lot of the times I had to learn how to like advocate for myself and be like, no, I want to ski this, and be that first person to make the move rather than just like let people decide my fate a little bit. So there's definitely some learning curves for me personally, but Blank is so awesome, and Alexi and the entire crew that he worked with is amazing, and it's just such a cherished memory for me. And I'm hoping to work with them again at some point. We tried to last year, but BC had such a low snow year that it didn't really work out.
Okay. So you filmed a lot with Anna during Blank, I feel like, and she's amazing. And you've always traditionally skied with a lot of women, which is crazy because we're in such a male-dominated industry. And
Mhm.
you've definitely had those trips where it's like 4 dudes and you lived in a place with like 12 dudes. So you're used to being in a male-dominated world. But have you ever almost felt like discriminated against because you're a woman, or like a line that you want, someone else is like, no, you take the softer line and I'm going to take this heavier line? Or does that not happen anymore?
I don't think that happens anymore. I feel like it's a very democratic process out there, regardless of gender. And I feel like a lot of the trips that I've been on that are male dominated have been like in Alaska. You know what I mean? Where I'm learning so much to begin with that I maybe don't want to step to the lines that those guys are picking out for themselves.
Yeah, I guess especially when you're going with Ian and Sage and those guys, they've done it 100 times in Alaska and you're there for the first time. Yeah, it is nice to sit in the back seat and kind of see what's going to go on. But my only other like sexist kind of question, which isn't a sexist question because that just makes me sound like a shitbag, but has any pro or industry guy like ever been like creepy and put the moves on you?
Oh, yeah, it happens all the time, but I feel like you get pretty good at deflecting that at a certain point. Like, I mean, I would love to say that that doesn't happen anymore, but it fully does. And I feel like I'm 34 years old and pretty much married at this point. So I don't think that that really affects me as much as like maybe it would have if I was younger. But I am sad that it still happens and I wish it was different.
Yeah, men can be pigs, and that is terrible, and it should change, but it hasn't altogether. So that does suck. But how does blank turn into the start of your TGR career? Do you get the call to come to Jackson for a tryout like so many have had, or do sponsors buy you in, or how does that work?
Yeah, so at that point, some sponsors bought me into it, but Jeff Thomas kind of made it happen, actually, because he was working with Blank, and he knows JK, who's one of the producers for TGR, very well, and he sent him an email on my behalf, and that's how it all kind of started happening for me.
And so with TGR, you do a bunch of trips, and you probably film a lot in Jackson, and I'm sure there's a lot of footage, but how much of that footage actually makes the movie?
Not a lot of it actually ends up making the movie. I feel like a lot of the time when you film with big production companies, especially if you go on a lot of trips, because there's so many athletes on so many trips and they're all filming a bunch. So they end up choosing your very best, like your AA footage. And so I would say like that first year that I filmed with them, maybe 1/4 of my footage ended up getting used.
Do you see the movie first at the premiere?
Yeah, totally. With TGR, it's a pretty insular process. Like they end up choosing what gets put into the movie for the most part. And so, yeah, they kind of make it so that all the athletes get to see it for the first time in the theater.
And can you describe the feelings of seeing yourself in a TGR movie for the first time?
Honestly, it was so insane. And that season, I got so much opportunity from TGR to film. I ended up on the Jackson Hole trip. I ended up at Mike Wigley's. I ended up in BC. So it was just kind of like a dream scenario. And yeah, I feel like for my first season, I was really fired up that year. And I felt pretty proud of my skiing that season.
Are you ever put out of your comfort zone that first year, just going to locations that you haven't been to before with some heavy hitters? Is it intimidating, or how does that go?
The first year I felt like it was a very soft launch into the TGR program because my first shoot with them, I did actually one day in BC, but my first real shoot with them was they called me on a Tuesday and they were like, can you be in Jackson on a Friday? We have this crazy storm coming in and like, we'd love to have you here for the powder segment. And I was like, absolutely. So I rolled down and I just shot powder for the first little bit. And then after that, I ended up back in BC doing sled access stuff with Nick McNutt primarily and Marcus Gogan and Wei Chen Ho, who are all friends of mine.
So that makes it a lot easier, right?
Yeah, and it's familiar territory. And the other thing is Max, my partner, was filming for them. His drone work is pretty phenomenal. So he ended up being the drone pilot for the BC and Wiggly segment. So it was very soft launch. It felt very normal.
So your boyfriend goes from like a guy who doesn't know how to film to a TGR filmer with your career.
Yeah, fully. He filmed with Blank as well when I was there. And yeah, we just moved up the ranks together.
Oh, that's pretty cool. That's pretty cool. And then in year 2 with TGR, is it kind of like, I need to go to Alaska? Is that kind of one of those things that's always in your head?
Well, I kind of felt like it was the next step for me a little bit, but also I'm a bit of a weather nerd, and I saw El Nino coming, and I knew that it was going to be likely a bad season in BC. So I wanted to set myself up with a contingency plan. So I started in July that year peppering JK with, hey, like, I want to go to Alaska. And so that fully ended up coming to fruition last year because BC had the worst snow year on record, and I ended up in Alaska.
And when you first get to Alaska, while you've seen it in movies countless times, how intimidating is it when you actually look at the peaks for the first time and you're like, holy shit, I'm going to ski that?
Dude, it was insane. It was literally insane. I didn't know what to expect, and I tried not to expect anything. But when I got there, I was absolutely blown away. Like, the zone that we ended up going to is this area called Spine Cell.
Yeah, I saw it in the movie. It was crazy.
Yeah, it's a 1,000-meter spine wall, very convoluted spines. And one really special thing was Sage actually pioneered that zone many years ago. So it was him coming back to that zone, and it was definitely a dream trip for Ian and Sage, and obviously us as well, like Kai and myself. But for them, I think it was like a really special trip, and I was just happy to be brought along on it.
I saw the movie the other night, and it was great. But there was a ton of acting in there. I don't remember you doing any of it, but was that like a weird thing to see these guys who aren't good actors try to act?
We were not the crew to have acting, first of all, but second of all, I actually had pneumonia by the end of the trip. I got super sick halfway through the trip, which obviously, like, there's not enough time to tell that story in a TGR film. But yeah, basically after the first sunny 3 days, I ended up getting super, super sick. And by the time I left Alaska, I had pneumonia.
Oh, that sucks. Well, I would think the scariest part from what I've heard in countless interviews is the whole blind rollover factor. How is that for you?
I mean, blind rollers exist everywhere, but a blind roller in Alaska is usually on top of a gnarly, gnarly spine line and way more vert. So the consequences of a blind rollover and ending up somewhere you don't want to be are much higher. And admittedly, it's kind of my Achilles heel in my skiing to begin with.
The rollover part?
Oh, yeah. I haven't really figured out how to like navigate that very confidently yet. I mean, I've had success with blind rollover lines, but it's not the thing that I choose for myself very often.
Fair enough. And with TGR, you've had the opportunity to go on some amazing trips with some all-time people. But if you have to call out the best trip of your TGR life, what would that be?
Best trip of my TGR life.
Or total life. It doesn't even have to be TGR. Just your best ski trip with the best crew over your career. What would that be?
It's honestly the Japan trip I did this year. It wasn't for filming at all. It was just a fun friend ski trip. And I was with Kat Beats, who I talked about earlier in the podcast, who is the ski patrol director who hired me in the first place for ski patrol. And we ended up going to Japan and doing Japan by van together along with her husband and another guide from CMH. And I feel like that was my best ski trip ever.
So you're going for the Japow, which everybody likes to get. And when I think about that, you being 5'1", it doesn't take much to have a deep pow day for you compared to like one of the taller people in the world.
Dude, this is what I tell everyone. I was like, if you want to make ankle deep pow look really deep, just send me in because I'm 5'1" and I am a trained powder skier from the Rockies, which means I made a lot of fake news in my day.
All right. Well, while I'm sure I missed some stuff, it's time for us to jump into the segment I call Inappropriate Questions. And I emailed you a while ago and I was like, who should I not get these questions from? And my plan was to call up the names that you said and get the questions from them because that would be the funny thing to do. You say, I don't want these people to ask the questions. I will get them to do that. But I made a pivot and I talked to one of your sponsors and I went out and got questions from Josh Hall. He's the founder of Dissent Labs and he's a self-professed sock nerd. And I was able to talk to him about his early days in Whistler and then about the whole sock deal. And then he's going to do inappropriate questions. So before that happens, there's going to be a little mini view with Josh where he's going to talk about being in Whistler in 1994. Then he's going to talk about some sock nerd shit for like 8 minutes. And then we're going to jump into your inappropriate questions. So Josh, while I have you coming on to ask inappropriate questions for Alex, I have some questions for you first. I saw a picture of you roped up with some Superforce 9s in what must have been like 1994. And I would think back in your prime ski bum days, where were you living and what did your ski life look like?
Yeah, that brings back some memories for sure. Those Force 9s I'd picked up at Whistler's Clear Out sort of turkey sale. But that photo, it's on the top of Blackcomb. It's at the very peak. You know, these days there'd be an ice axe from Trevor Peterson up there. And at the time, you know, I wasn't getting skied that much. And my buddy Casey and I thought it was a good idea to ski it almost in the middle of the day. And it's a permanent closure, and maybe I shouldn't be talking about this, but I lost my pass pretty quickly that day. Let's just say that.
Oh, they caught you.
Oh, yeah.
What happens when they catch you doing something like that?
So it was late afternoon, let's say, and, you know, the line, it's pretty prominent, though. You can see it right from the Seventh Heaven chair, and it's totally stupid. This is what you do when you're 18, right? And I was new to town that year, and it's something I just stared at every day, and I wanted to go up there and ski it. Anyway, I rappelled in, put my skis on, thought I was home free. And sure enough, there's a couple of red coats waiting for you. And what happens? You end up in the box. I got a lift up with the guys of the Horseman Hut, got chewed out. You have to watch some instructional videos. You lose your pass. It was going to be a pass pull till the end of the season, but somehow I pleaded my case that I was leaving town to go back to university and I needed like a little more ski time. And yeah, lost my pass for 2 weeks and I still skied in that time. It was one of those memorable moments from that 95. You're right. It wasn't quite 94 or that was probably a 1994 ski. But yeah, I was skiing it in 95.
Those skis had a cult status, which is pretty cool to see that ski in the photo because I think people really loved that ski at that point. But it was pre-New School. And when you think of that, like who were the ski heroes of that time in Whistler?
Oh, man. The crew around Whistler at that time, like it was the people you know today. It was really almost unfortunate. Like I look back now and I left town right before the twin tip came out. And guys were talking about skiing backwards. I was like, what the hell are you talking about? We're skiing backwards now. And yeah, I remember when the guys from Quebec, like Vinny Dorion and JP and JF Cousson, like I remember when those guys just like smashed the thing wide open. And that was right before that blew up. I mean, you had lots of guys doing some big mountain stuff. The day I skied that line, actually, which is named after Trevor, that was the day he passed in France.
Whoa.
Yeah, it was heavy for sure. Yeah, it's a time you can look back to as the birthplace or the birth time of modern free skiing, really. But for myself, like, I split town right at that time. It was about to just explode. But no regrets.
This is all pre-Interwest, pre-Vail. What was better about that time in history in Whistler?
Well, you could get parking. That's for one. You know, it was still a busy town. Like, Whistler back then was already award-winning. The two mountains weren't together at that point. They were separate mountains. They operated independently.
So 2 lift tickets you had to get if you wanted to do both mountains in one day.
Exactly. I think the pass back then, it was like $300. But, you know, you look around these days and a lot of it hasn't changed, man. Like, the energy's still there. The energy's still the same. It was sweet. Like, it really was a cool time. For me, I was 18. Like, I couldn't even get in the bar. You find a way, but for me as an 18-year-old kid, like the day I left for Whistler, you know, I had maybe a couple $1,000 in my bank account and just tried to make it work, you know, and almost left town. Some of the same problems that then still exist today, trying to find a place to live, was not easy then. You know, I was sleeping in my car and there was no internet back then. So you just go from bulletin board to bulletin board and wait for somebody to post up anything that you could get for a room. And maybe that was the start of Whistler getting busy. Who knows?
I mean, my takeaway is you paid $300 for a season pass, but these days, if you walk up to the ticket office, $300 might get you on the mountain for a day, which is absolutely batshit crazy, but that's kind of how skiing is gone if you don't buy one of those season passes. So different worlds altogether. But back then, it was a different world because the gear was so much different, and we talked about the Super Force 9s and stuff, but it sounds like gear's different. It made things a little bit more difficult. But what made things really, really difficult for you was your feet. And what issues were you having with your feet? I usually don't talk to people about their feet, and I don't have a foot fetish, but we're going to talk about feet for a minute. What was the deal with yours?
That winter was the moment I realized I had terrible skin for ski touring, I guess. ski touring wasn't even a thing. Like back then, there was a handful of people getting in the backcountry. We had essentially alpine trekkers or terrible things like Secura fixes or whatever you get your hands on basically to get you in the backcountry. And I had no idea. I went out with a couple of guys that had been banned from the mountain. Like these were guys that were also skiing permanent closures, and they got banned. And my buddy Mike said, hey, let's go ski touring with these guys. And we went out to a cabin not that far away from town, just north of Pemberton. And I was running trekkers, and within 30 minutes, my heels, like I could just tell like I was getting a blister. But I wasn't going to say anything to these guys. These guys were like badasses, like they've got their poster up in the patrol hut. I'm not going to say anything to these guys. I'm just going to keep going. So I tough it out, and I can tell my feet are a mess. And we get to the cabin. Can't wait to pull my boots off. I peel my socks off, which are just gross and soaking wet. And this is probably after about an hour and a half, 2 hours. And my feet are just hammered, like bleeding, blisters all over my heels. And the guys are mortified. They're like, dude, why didn't you say something? I'm like, well, it just is what it is. You just keep going. So it was pretty hard to ski the next day. We toured and did some lines close to the cabin. Stability wasn't great, so we didn't really get on anything significant. But it was a great first experience. And from there, I was hooked. So I would keep coming back to Whistler. Like I was in university, and I would come back to Whistler for a week or 2 weeks or whatever I could pull off. And I'd go ski touring. Same thing. I'd blow my feet up. I'd tape and try different socks, and nothing really seemed to work. So fast forward, I'm finished school. I'm working at some event as a rep. I'm working at a triathlon. I get a pair of compression socks randomly because, you're at a triathlon, so you have to wear your knee-high compression socks and kind of look crazy while you're, walking around. This is like normal attire, apparently.
Yeah. I mean, triathletes have a little bit of a funky style per se. It's functional.
Yeah, exactly. Functional. So I was just trying to fit in. It was at an Ironman in Penticton. And I finished the day, and I'm like, man, these things, I hate to say it, but they're actually pretty good. And I would wear them for hiking. And then that fall, I'd wear them for a couple bike rides. And then I started thinking like, hey, I should try skiing in these things. Like, I bet this would be a great starting point for ski touring. Like, they feel better, like it's fitted. And then I started researching, what can you do to socks to make them like this? Like, what can you do to make them better? And I kind of just kept going down the so-called rabbit hole, I always say, like a little bit more, and researching what yarn is available. Like, where do you make these things? Can you just buy a machine and put it in your garage? And pretty quickly you realize that's not how it works. These are big operations. The factories are all over the world. So I started emailing guys, and I'm like, hey, I see that you've got some of these yarns I would like to check out and maybe build some socks, and don't get any answers back. Finally, some guy calls me. His name's Rick, and he leaves me a message. He's like, hey man, stop bugging the factories. I don't know who you are, but we've got lots of brands that we're already working with. Thanks, but no thanks. But call me tomorrow if you want to talk. So I kind of found that as like a bit of an opening. And so I phone him, and I'm like, hey Rick, I've got an idea for like a really specific type of ski sock that just fits better and performs better, and it's going to be great for ski touring. He didn't know what ski touring was. And I just said, listen, like, nobody's going to be doing this stuff. Like, nobody cares. And he's just not having it. And finally I said, Rick, listen, like, if nobody does this, nobody will ever give a shit. Like, everything out there is pretty terrible. This will never happen. He's like, you know what? Stuff is actually pretty bad out there. I would love to give you a hand. Let me see what I can do. And I think my persistence paid off, and he made some connections for us with some of the biggest factories out there, which, looking back, it probably wouldn't have happened. If it wasn't for that chance meeting with him, like, we wouldn't be having this chat. It was really clear that you would just get nowhere with a factory. If you're just calling out of the blue, I had to make like a pseudo landing page of sorts on a website. I called it Dissent. It was the idea about Dissent being to challenge the status quo. It's kind of a play on words about descending. So I got this really fortunate meetup with these big players, and the next thing you know, I'm sampling and developing new stuff, and my house is full of socks. And there we are. Like, we're kind of on our way.
So this whole thing is built out of necessity. I won't say it's a selfish thing, but it's obviously you need socks that are going to get you out on the skin track and not tear your feet apart. You're able to build those with your Ironman sock threads that you found at that event, and you talk to Rick, and all these things happen. And then when you're prototyping and you're building socks, it's like you have an all-time team of sock testers. Can you just name the names of the people that help you develop these socks?
Yeah. Being based out of Whistler really allowed us to tap into some smart people that obviously ski a ton, that really put the miles in. So once I had something that I was pretty confident with, like the first guy I thought in my mind that I would reach out to would be Hoji. If you know who, Eric Hjorlifson is, like the guy's a savant. He is the right kind of person to give you feedback on product because Hoji has his own development space for himself to make prototypes for bindings, for parts for his boots. Like,
he's the rare athlete and product engineer all rolled up into one. Maybe he doesn't have the product engineering degree, but he might as well.
Exactly. And then we joke, he is like a self-taught engineer. So I gave him some of the new socks to test and vet and give me some like real world feedback and some honest opinions on it. And smart guys like Hoj, like those are the guys I would try to reach out to. Like I wasn't really interested in just going after like an influencer who just maybe had a ton of followers. Instagram was like, say, pretty new at the time.
Like the Sean Pettit wasn't your target. It was the guy who's actually going to do the product work on the back end where Sean's going to get the rock star coverage. That wasn't what you were looking for. I mean, it sounds like you were more of a product nerd than a marketing genius in the whole grand scheme of things.
Exactly. Even as of today, like I'm still a product guy. I mean, that's where this is all still going for sure. The funny thing about Sean, like with Sean Pettit, like he more recently became a Dissent guy. The guys when they're young, you're bulletproof, right? You don't need fancy gear. You don't need all the, advantages and all those 1% things you can do because you're strong and you're young. And Sean reached out only maybe 2 years ago. He's like, hey man, like my brother Callum gave me these socks. And he's like, these socks are awesome. And so Sean and I started chatting. We actually built him a collab sock last year, like something for his personal project. And a lot of times we won't do patterns. I mean, if you know Dissent, like we don't do patterns and colors that often.
It's function first. It's not a marketing sock.
Exactly. We are function first. We have a few colors now in the lineup, but we had black socks only for the first 8 years in business. It was definitely a technical sock that just ticked all the boxes. Fashion had nothing to do with it. A lot of the stores don't really want their entire wall to be aged. Every time you do a patterned or a colored sock, the thing ages and then you got to clear it out. A lot of our retailers, especially the boot fitters that were with us from the early days, like they loved the idea that they could just get black socks. And when they ran out, they just ordered more. It never changed. They weren't having to clear things out.
And carryover product for you makes life a lot easier.
It totally makes life easier. Like our jam was just to make the best thing possible, satisfy the core users. But I would definitely say we have the best every person sock now. I think it ticks all the boxes. It's a little easier to get on. It's warm. It has natural fibers. It's a little easier on the environment. It's actually a great product for anybody. So we're trying to allow our retailers to have a little more Dissent on the wall and fill the hooks up a bit more.
And when you think about filling the hooks up a little bit more, you're also part of a family of brands now. Did Thermic buy Dissent from you? And are you still like the head guy of Dissent under the Thermic umbrella? Because it sounds like the brands are together. And I say it sounds like because we're working together. And I know my ads put both of the brands together. And it's like Thermic is for heat and Dissent is for feet. It's like a different positioning, but owned by Thermic. Is that how the whole pyramid works?
The parent company of Thermic is CDAS. And they've got amazing global distribution. And we've been together or working together since 2013. So only a year after the Dissent launch, we were already being distributed by CDAS in North America. So we'd be at the trade shows together. We knew the business that they run in boot fitting is super strong. They almost invented the category, I would say, of modern custom footbeds for skiing. Like they are the guys. And Dissent fits into that very nicely because we have great socks that make the job of boot fitters easier. And CDAS is super successful with their range of socks in Europe. They've got global distribution. But yeah, we are essentially a part of that CDAS world And for me personally, it allows me to stay in charge or the head of Dissent for development and what it looks like globally. And I get to help out on some of the new Thermic projects and do some cool stuff there. I mean, I'm a product guy at heart, and I love what those guys do. You know, they have powered heat for socks, but what you're going to see from those guys long term is cool stuff. It'll be a brand that does not just heat, but also cooling. So yeah, it's a great chance for us to kind of work together officially. Myself, I'm looking forward to getting my hands dirty with some of the Thermic product and some of the design and seeing Dissent grow globally.
So it sounds like the deal is Thermic is all about heat. Dissent is for those that don't need heat. But speaking of heat, it's time for what I call inappropriate questions. And we're going to stop the foot talk and get into the inappropriateness. And I want you to ask 3 inappropriate questions to one of your athletes. We have Alex Armstrong on the podcast. She is going to get 3 inappropriate questions from you. And are you ready with question number 1 for Army?
The first question comes from your good buddy, Emily. So, Army, we're all big fans of your current boyfriend, Max, but in a previous dating life, you just had to ski away from a cliffed out boyfriend one time. Do you feel guilty about that? How big was the so-called cliff? And what advice can you give for both girls and guys in a similar dating situation?
Okay, so actually Emily and her boyfriend skied away from my cliffed out boyfriend. I stuck around. I did the right thing. But I will give this guy credit. He started dating me. He was an ice climber and he decided to become a skier. And I think this was like his 3rd year skiing. And we ended up going to Revelstoke. And it's a big hyped up crew. All the blondes are there. So Tanya, Emily, and Janelle, as well as their boyfriends who are all ripping skiers and they know Revelstoke super, super well. And I'm already a little bit on edge because I know that this guy maybe cannot hang.
Like you brought the weak link?
Definitely. But we love him for trying. And naturally, we end up in this zone that has like a mandatory cliff ban. And we all send it. It's a powder day, so there's very much no consequence. And it's also maybe like 5 to 6 high. And poor guy gets on top of it and he's there and we're all cheering him on for maybe like the first 2 minutes. And then as it wears on, everyone's getting a little bit more and more like, hey, it's a frickin' powder day. Like, what the hell are you doing? And eventually Emily's boyfriend ends up yelling at him. And they end up skiing off and I stuck around and I ended up having to like walk back up to the cliff and like kind of coach him down. Uh-huh. And I think that I was pretty kind about it, but it definitely was like a moment where I was like, oh no, what have I gotten myself into?
Oh, that's funny.
But I was also 3 years into the relationship, so I was committed. I was like, oh God.
Does it end pretty soon after that when you realize you just can't hang on the mountain, or does that not factor into it at all?
No, I don't think it factored into my decision making for a relationship, to be honest. He ended up becoming the head of ski patrol at Lake Louise, and he's quite a phenomenal skier now. So yeah, I'd like to say that I did great work there.
Wow. Well, I hope he makes more than $7.50 an hour at this point.
I think he's gotten a few pay raises since then.
Great. All right. So we're going to go to question number 2.
This one comes from Alexi Godbout. He's spent some good time with you out in the backcountry, so he's been privy to a few things. So what he asks is, what's a down low guilty pleasure for you while you're out filming the backcountry, especially when you're, say, transitioning or ripping skins?
All right, you know what he's talking about.
I know exactly what Alexi is talking about, and I'm not afraid to say it. You know, sometimes, whether you win or lose a pillow line, sometimes you got to have a good dart about it. And, you know, it's one of my guilty pleasures when I'm out there, and I feel like it keeps my head on straight and maybe a holdout for my tree planting days, to be honest.
A dart? Like a cowboy killer?
Yeah, a little bit of a cowboy killer, you know. None of that green in there, but yeah, I don't mind the tobacco sometimes.
So it's a spliff without the weed, which is crazy, but you never really hear that with pro athletes. But you know what? Who cares? The kids shouldn't listen to this and they shouldn't do it. But it was super fun to do it when I was way younger. But either way, we're going to go to your third and final inappropriate question, which you're going to hear. And then I'm going to have to ask you another question because I feel like you've already answered this.
Mm-hmm.
This one comes from Emily again. What does cozy or die mean to you? And the follow-on question to that is, you've worked some tough gigs in the past, Alex. So is cozy or die a reaction to a specific time you can recall?
All right. Is it a reaction to a specific time? Because we talked about cozy or die right in the beginning.
I don't know. I always feel like I had the cozy gene in me. To quote my grandpa, if you give a lazy man a job, he's going to do it in the most efficient way possible. And I feel like I always tried to do things efficiently so that I could get back to being cozy, whether it was a hard job or an easy job. So I think I've always had the cozy or die gene going on. And yeah, I feel like everything that I do allows me to be cozy at some point. And yeah, been working hard to be cozier.
All right, well, we'll follow that up with, can you tell the story behind the New York City TGR premiere? It sounds like you and your family went huge.
Oh, no. I don't know if my dad might kill me, honestly.
Just don't send him the podcast.
So last year, my dad, my aunt, my uncle, and my stepmom, who I like to call my bonus mom, Lori, came down to see the TGR premiere. We sent it pretty hard, as you do. We ended up at an Irish pub dancing to Shania Twain to all hours, and we had a little mishap, and someone put their shoulder out, and we ended up at Cedar Sinai, which, always a sign of a good time.
All right. Well, big night and an unfortunate ending, it sounds like. That's Inappropriate Questions, and that's our podcast. And really, your story is so cool because you went pro when a lot of people's careers were like winding down, which is a hard thing to do. It's like you're 34 years old now. And what's even cooler is that you're the equivalent of a person that started as the intern and then kept getting promoted until you were the president of the company. I mean, you went from coaching kids to working in a shop to doing shit jobs at a ski town to ski patrolling to getting sponsored with product at 26 to a few years later, you put more work in than almost anybody to get yourself a real paid sponsorship. And I guess the moral of your story is never quit, keep having fun, and good things will happen. And while that doesn't work out for everyone, it did for you. And I thank you for telling your story, and I thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Your research was so in-depth. Good work.
So that was time with Alex Armstrong, and what a long road it was for Army to make it to the big time. Nowadays, she has her ski career where anyone would want it, filming with one of the giants in the industry. But it's so crazy that didn't happen until so late for her. And it will be interesting to see how long she can go. I mean, she's made it through 5 knee surgeries, so the wear and tear of injury hasn't slowed her down. But will old age do it? Who knows? Time will tell. But these days, Army is on top of the world, and it sounds like she's enjoying the shit out of it, and she's still celebrating with darts. I should have let her know that could stunt her growth. That's the podcast. At this point, I want to thank you for listening and ask you to star rate me on Spotify. And if you're listening on iTunes, I'll take a star rating, but I'd love a full-on review. And here's how you do it. If you're on an iPhone, tap the purple podcast icon, then search for the Powell Movement. And even if you already subscribe, you still need to do this search. Then when my logo pops up, click that logo. Next, scroll down to where you see the stars, then star rate me. And if you really want to make a difference and go above and beyond the call of duty, write a short or a long review. It takes about 30 to 40 seconds to do all of this, and it's greatly appreciated. Finally, I want to ask you again to support my incredible sponsors as they really do make this podcast happen. They are Thermic Heated Socks, Elan Skis, Stanley, Outdoor Research, and Best Day Brewing. Have a great week, everyone.